Speaker is providing national leadership from his post at the helm of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Mike Boots, who has led that organization since the middle of this year, has decades of experience at CEQ, in the Environmental Protection Agency, and on Capitol Hill. He is truly one of President Obama's go-to guys when it comes to climate change adaptation. He is an avid outdoorsman, and by all descriptions, Mike Boots is a great guy to work with. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome to the podium Mike Boots of the White House Council on Environmental Quality.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to Joel as well and the Chesapeake Conservancy folks for bringing this conference together and for having me here today to help kick it off. You know, I'm particularly excited to be here. I end up going to a lot of conferences, but it's pretty rare to see a group this big, this diverse, from this many parts of the country, all coming together to talk about landscapes. That I have not been to before, so it's great that you guys were able to pull this together. Of course, everyone here in this room certainly understands the importance and the value of a landscape level approach to natural resources management. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. But you know, it's something that the general public is not hearing about every day. It's not something that they're talking about every day. It's not something that the press is covering every day. And quite frankly, as I think many of you know, we actually have a little bit of a vocabulary issue when we talk about landscapes, where I think most people out there think we're talking about landscaping rather than landscapes. So we have some challenges of our own just in terms of getting the attention of folks. But the truth is, if we can make landscape scale conservation standard practice, Americans and our natural systems will benefit for years and years to come. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes here today to talk a little bit about what landscape scale conservation has looked like in the Obama administration, and to tell you a little bit about, hopefully, some of the new and creative ways that we have charted a path forward on this policy area over the last 5.5 years. Some of my other colleagues who will be with you later in the day from across the administration, I think will dig a little bit deeper into what that looks like on the ground. But I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about what we're doing and where we're headed next. First, though, we should spend just a few minutes talking about the challenges that we face on this front, which, as you all know, are pretty numerous. Of course, there's climate change at the top of that list. States, cities, communities all around this country depend on bountiful natural resources from across America, and climate change is putting so many of those resources at risk every day. Droughts in some parts of the country are getting longer and drier. Floods are increasing in frequency and volume. Wildfires are causing more devastation than ever before. And we're also dealing with heavily polluted bodies of water. And the health of those watersheds don't just impact the environment, they impact local and regional economies every day. We're seeing a growing list of imperiled wildlife species. And then there's the ever-encroaching presence of development of all kinds on our outdoor spaces, from housing and transportation to energy and other commercial development. And so, like I said, the challenges are many. And they're too big for any agency or part of government or NGO or landowner to tackle alone. And after all, as you all know, Mother Nature pays no attention to the political and jurisdictional boundaries that we draw. And so to take on those challenges, the only answer is to do that collaboratively across all those boundaries. That means federal agencies and tribes, states and local governments. It means academia, nonprofits, and the philanthropic community. It means really partnering with the private sector and the millions of private landowners who will have so much to benefit from this approach that we're talking about here at this conference. It's that approach, considering all lands and listening to all voices, that really best defines landscape-level conservation. And whether it's responding to wildfires, or making lands more resilient to climate change, or restoring polluted rivers and lakes, we have strived to make that approach a hallmark of the way that this administration does its conservation business. This approach is having a positive impact on a lot of different policy areas, but I wanted to just talk briefly this morning about three that are really at the top of our priority list when it comes to the President's conservation agenda. And in all of these priority areas, preparing for and responding to climate change, protecting and restoring our water resources, and improving land management for multiple uses, we have made some important progress over the last 5.5 years. But we also have a lot more work to do, and we need all of you to help us do that work. Clearly, we cannot have a meaningful conversation about natural resources without acknowledging the impact that climate change is having on them. The President's made very clear that we have a moral obligation to leave behind for our children and our children's children a healthier and a safer and a less polluted planet. And that's why last year he laid out his climate action campaign to both reduce carbon pollution that drives climate change and to prepare communities for the impacts of climate that are too late to avoid. A key part of that plan is preparing our lands and waters for climate impacts, managing our natural carbon sinks, anticipating and then responding to extreme weather like droughts and wildfire. Because the fact is that carbon pollution has been building up in our atmosphere for decades. And so even as we take all the necessary steps to reduce emissions, we're going to keep feeling those impacts for years and years to come. So as a start, across this country, we have ramped up our technical assistance to local landowners and communities to make sure that their management decisions are informed by the best available science and data. These efforts have helped ranchers across the country, for example, develop scalable and localized land management strategies to deal with drought. Through our Climate Data Initiative, we're working to make sure that we improve resilience of the agricultural sector and making data available on climate change vulnerabilities to our food production and our supply systems, making that available to farmers and ranchers, but also to entrepreneurs and innovators and researchers who can go develop applications and businesses and tools that help those folks make better decisions. And we've taken lessons from disasters like Hurricane Sandy to help us build smarter and safer and stronger for the next storm, not just planning for the last one, which often means better valuing our natural resources. As you all know, sometimes the most effective way to build resilience to natural resources and natural disasters involves investments in the natural infrastructure, in green stormwater infrastructure, in things like urban forests and permeable pavements and rainwater harvesting. And competitive grants that we have issued over the last several years, things like our $1 billion National Disaster Resilience Competition and the Coastal Resiliency Program from the Department of the Interior for $100 million. Those two grant programs recognize that reality and in fact prioritize more than ever before the resilient investments that are part of it. So we've made some progress over the last few years, but it is incredibly important that we keep at it. That's why this month we issued something called the Climate and Natural Resources Priority Agenda, along with a list of public and private commitments to support it. That agenda represents our commitment to manage natural resources in a way that really optimizes carbon storage and sequestration, and to enhance community preparedness through smart and safe natural infrastructure investments. It prioritizes and advances some of the groundbreaking work that I think you're going to hear about throughout this workshop from the federal agencies that they have been pursuing for the last 5 years. And if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to take a look at this priority agenda, both to get a sense of where we're headed, but also to give us a sense of whether you think we got it right or whether we got it wrong, or if there's places that we can be emphasizing. But just to give you one example, agencies from the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Defense have committed in this priority agenda to identifying some priority geographic regions over the next 6 months, and from there, developing together action plans for those regions, which will focus efforts on building more climate-resilient lands and waters, enhancing carbon storage capacity, and supporting management needs. That work together in priority geographies is a real change in the way that this administration is approaching this issue. And moving forward, we'll also be developing some new tools and training, launching some new programs to fight the spread of invasive species, and engaging in some new efforts to prioritize landscape conservation efforts across multiple conservation areas. So that's a quick snapshot of where we are on climate change, but now let me dig a little more deeper into the second area I want to talk a bit about, and that's protecting and restoring our waters in face of both climate change, pollution, and increasing pressures for this increasingly scarce resource. This is another area where the administration is trying to tackle it in a different way than we might have in the past, and to do so by working across some traditional boundaries. We have dedicated an unprecedented amount of attention and resources over the last 5.5 years to places like the Chesapeake Bay, the California Bay Delta, the Everglades, the Great Lakes, and the Gulf Coast. And each of these places is a national treasure in its own right, and a lifeblood of both local and regional economies that drive so much activity in those places. And each of them is also suffering from unique management challenges and decades upon decades of pollution. And to restore those iconic bodies of water, we have to think big. We have to think bigger than we have in the past, and we have to work collaboratively to get there. And so with so many challenges and overlapping jurisdictions, working in silos would guarantee that we're both wasting money and wasting time, and it would also guarantee that we would only see some results around the margins. And so that reality and the opportunity that landscape scale conservation brings has really driven our work in places like the Everglades, for example. Provides a great example of some of the landscape scale partnerships that we have really invested in over the last few years. That effort has brought together federal, state, tribal, and local players and a huge number of private sector interests to address issues like habitat fragmentation and wildlife protection and the continued productivity of that region's farms and ranches and forests and coasts. And we are seeing some significant progress, some real changes from the status of that system a decade ago. And it really gives us some reason for optimism. And in the Chesapeake Bay region, which Joel was talking about earlier, following the president's executive order in 2009, everyone who has a stake in that effort has had a chance to come to the table to tackle that problem together. Just months ago, through the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, federal agencies, state governments, and a wide range of other partners on the ground and in the water renewed their commitment to protecting this vital watershed. And all of those players are going to be working together to take necessary steps like setting targets for reducing nutrient pollution, which is a huge, huge challenge for the Bay. So we will continue to be investing in some of these priority ecosystems in a way that brings everyone to the table and takes a look at that big picture. And we'll also continue to refine other water-related policies that are having a big impact outside of those systems. Things like modernizing the 30-year-old policy that guides how the federal government invests in water resource management and water resource projects. This may or may not be on your radar, but our efforts to change and reform the principles and guidelines for water resources is a big game changer that is going to help agencies from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to the Bureau of Reclamation better factor landscape scale conservation into their day-to-day decisions about which projects they engage in and support. And we're doing the same thing in the third area that I want to highlight, and that is on land. One of the key goals we have is to better manage land for multiple uses. This includes energy development, outdoor recreation, wildlife habitat, and a whole list of other things that are important to Americans across the country. You all know that managing public lands for multiple uses is nothing new. It's been the struggle for decades and decades, even longer. Conflict between different uses is a long-standing issue, and it's only going to become more prevalent as population growth continues and development pressures grow on those important landscapes. We're always going to have a need for domestic energy development, and we're always going to have a need to make sure that we're ensuring productive agricultural land in this country. And as cities and towns expand, thousands of acres of open space are lost each day, which are increasing demand for that very precious and scarce outdoor recreation space. So taking an integrated and a landscape-level approach to planning and land use management is quite simply the only way for us at the federal level to set the right tone about meeting those increasing demands without also increasing conflict. And if we get it right, energy development and wildlife management and recreation will all benefit. Later today, as Jim said, Secretary Jewell will be here to speak about how the Department of the Interior is doing just that. For example, their Smart from the Start approach to siting renewable energy production provides a really great blueprint for how you invest in planning early on to minimize conflict at the end of the game. And their master leasing plans for oil and gas provide another great model on that front. I know there are a lot of folks from DOI that are here today, and I just want to thank them for their work on those efforts, which I think are really providing a new model for how that department is approaching some of these issues. And thinking and planning at the landscape level is also essential to rebuilding populations of endangered species. As more and more habitat is lost or fragmented, more and more wildlife species are getting to be on the brink of extinction. And if we enlist states and private landowners in a conversation about that reality, and we try to ensure greater consistency and predictability across an ecosystem, not just in small pockets, we can ensure a process that hopefully is less contentious and better for the wildlife in the end. Of course, some wildlife have large migration ranges, and they simply need more space. That's true on the land, just as it is in the water. And the president knows this and isn't afraid to take bold action to protect those hotspots of biodiversity. He did that just last month when he expanded the Pacific Remote Islands National Marine Monument to become the largest fully protected marine area in the world. And there are many other areas where we can pursue a landscape-level approach to land management. But we can't talk about public land management without also mentioning access. I said earlier that the general public doesn't always think about these issues, about landscape-level approaches, or even about conflict over land use, and that's true. But I think Americans truly could get invested in some of the most important conservation issues of our time if we did everything we could to ensure that they are more connected to these treasured outdoor spaces. It's been a hallmark of the way we've approached our work from both a protection and a conservation side. That's why earlier this month when the president designated the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument in Los Angeles, he preserved some of the last remaining open space in that really park-poor region of the country, but he also made a point of telling the folks out there that he wasn't taking that step to lock up those mountains. He was taking that step to unlock that amazing large landscape for a set of folks who didn't necessarily think of that as their own. So I want to stop there. I want to thank you again for having me here today to talk a little bit about the path we're on, but mostly I want to say, while I still have you here, a big thank you for the work that you're doing. Those of you in this room have done an amazing amount of work to develop and to advocate and to implement this landscape scale approach on the ground. This topic, again, is never going to drive the headlines on the cable news networks, but your work is so critical, and it really is a game changer to how we approach natural resource management in this country. And this work, your work, is something that future generations of Americans are going to come to value in a very big way. So to make progress in the future, we're going to need to continue to have you playing that role. We're going to need you to highlight efforts that are working well. We're going to need you to be telling us places where we should be doing more. We're going to need you to tell us where you need better data or more information and where we can be more strategic to get some better results. So what I can commit to you is we're going to continue to keep putting this at the top of the president's conservation agenda. And we need you to keep doing your part, to be bringing your creativity and your pragmatism and your leadership on the ground to this effort day to day. So I know I speak for all of us at the White House and my colleagues across the administration that work on this front, but we are very, very much looking forward to partnering with you on this important work going forward. So thank you all.